This is a weekend of remembrance. As we observe Memorial Day, we remember all of those who have died in service to our country. Originally called Decoration Day when it began after the Civil War, it was a day to strew flowers and wreaths upon the graves of those who had died. In the South, it is said that the graves were decorated for both Union and Confederate soldiers alike. These days, as an official federal holiday, it's likely to come with parades and speeches and wreaths of poppies, reminiscent of the poppies that grew on the graves in Flanders Field, the only thing that would grow on this World War I battleground. This has been a personal weekend of remembrance for me, as I participated on Friday in the memorial service of one of my stepdaughters in a room filled with photos, flowers, memorabilia, and the memories and stories poured forth from family and friends. And this morning, like every Sunday morning, we sit in this holy space, surrounded not only by images of Jesus and his disciples in our windows, but also by the memorial plaques for those who built and supported this church through the years, to say nothing of the echoes of the voices that prayed here and sang, laughed, and cried within these walls. What we do not see is an image of Lydia, or of all of the Lydias, named or unnamed, who are remembered only in a very few brief words of Scripture. The story in a nutshell is that on the Sabbath there in Philippi, Paul, Silas, and Timothy went looking for a synagogue, a place of prayer by the riverside. They came upon a group of women. Though this was probably not what they imagined as a place of prayer, they stayed and took advantage of the opportunity to preach. They found an interested listener who converted, was baptized along with her whole household, and then offered her home to Paul and his companions. That's it. 7 short verses. Just a tiny, maybe insignificant part of the collage of stories of Paul's journeys. And it may be why this has been ignored. Not even in our election, it was not even in our elections until the Episcopal Church adopted the Revised Common Lectionary about 12 years ago. Fortunately, people have now seen some hints here about life in the times and travels of Paul, hints that could add more color and interest to the story of the growth and development of the church. These more curious folk have asked and tried to answer some questions that might spring to mind. Who is this Lydia in the story? A woman merchant? How can that be? What about the purple cloth? What are these women doing down by the riverside anyway? Lydia has been considered by some to be the first European convert. She was called a worshiper of God, often translated as God-fearer. This term is somewhat obscure, but may indicate a person who is not a Jew but is attracted to the Jewish religion. Whatever she was very open to the movement of the Spirit and to Paul's message. Most will agree that Lydia was an independent woman of means. Purple cloth was a luxury item for royalty and the wealthy, so she had access to the elite of her society. There is no mention of a husband, so perhaps she was the head of her household. And in offering her home as a center for Paul, she showed herself to be a benefactor, one of those biblical women who made the ministry possible by providing money and housing. The question of what the women were doing down by the riverside illustrates the difference in approach that some of the newer scholars have taken. They would suggest that the riverside gathering of women was the place of prayer, the synagogue that Paul and his companions were searching for. More traditional scholars might dismiss that idea by noting that our biblical sources do not give any indication of women being allowed to serve as synagogue leaders. In fact, there are prohibitions recorded. They would view Paul's stop by the riverside as simply a side trip on his journey to the real synagogue. Other writings beyond the biblical witness, such as inscriptions and archaeological data, however, do find instances of strong leadership on the part of women in the Greek and Roman world, including their participation in the Jewish synagogue life in the diaspora. So it might not be too much of a stretch of the imagination to think of Lydia as the founder of the church in Philippi, which became one of the strongest of the new communities and churches. So might we, instead of assuming that women had little or no role in the development of the early church, consider the appearance of a woman, particularly one given a name, to be like the tip of an iceberg. That in order for her to show up in the record at all, she must be so important that the writer cannot ignore her. So there must be more below the surface. Perhaps you think this is all academic speculation. Does it make a difference? Well, I think so. First of all, when we can see ourselves in the biblical stories, they tend to have a more profound impact on us and on our faith. Here's an example using Lydia's story. This is made up, by the way. It's an example. Using the social and historical data that's been found for that time and place, there are at least two possibilities for Lydia's background. And her story could have been heard in two different ways, speaking to people of varying lifestyles. Lydia could have been a former slave or freedwoman of the imperial household, who, after acquiring her freedom, would have used her skills to become an independent householder. The story heard this way could be a welcome sign of hope and possibility for other women of slave or freed status, or women who feel imprisoned and oppressed by their social context. Alternatively, she could have been a part of the citizen class, a free woman of Greek or Roman origin, widowed or never married. For those who heard that story, she would have provided an inspiring example of an independent businesswoman who offered her resources in a meaningful way to the forming religious community to which she had converted, an example to be emulated. Another important reason it is necessary to hear other voices is this. Over the years, church has used the biblical record as an example of how the Christian community should be organized. Women and minorities have been kept in their place, using the Bible as justification. In many places, even today, this is still the case. Certain people are not as equal as others, are not provided with all the rights and privileges accorded to those in power. It's so easy to defend the status quo, the heady power of patriarchy, by maintaining a narrow focus and discounting other approaches. If we do not allow ourselves to listen to and be moved by other voices, these patterns will never be changed. And yet, the broad and sweeping message of Acts and other scriptures seems to be that the gospel message is for all. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, woman nor man. It wasn't just Lydia who was open to the movement of the Spirit that Sabbath morning by the river. Paul was open also to see what he did not expect. He did not walk on, continuing to look for what he was expecting to see. He stopped there, and because of that, a new Christian community was formed. Who is it that we overlook as we go about our daily lives, or especially our life together as church? Do we overlook those who can no longer be present with us on a regular basis? Do we overlook those who are on the fringes of our congregation? And do we overlook those outside our walls? It's easy for us to become drab and colorless when we go through life in our habitual ways, surrounding ourselves with the usual people and events, not taking time to open ourselves to the surprises that might be right in front of us, but unnoticed in our routines and busyness. It's important to remember, too, the stories of those who have preceded us in life, those whose lives and work created a foundation upon which we can continue to build. We have not done it all by ourselves, whether it's a church community, a circle of family and friends, or a free and secure society. For those we remember gave of themselves, sacrificed maybe even their lives, and made contributions to what we live today. Each one of us has a story that adds texture to the collage of humanity. I do wonder if Lydia were standing here beside me, what she would think of this little reading. Would she be grateful that she gets this small mention that we continue to read 2 millennia later? Or would she be disappointed, even maybe horrified by such a small presence? Would she have said something like, "Oh, that Paul, what would he have done without us? How would the gospel have spread without our support that helped him survive? Our baptisms that made us new disciples, our hospitality that invited others in and kept the story alive, even our purple cloth that made us stand out from the crowd." As we remember today, might we ask ourselves how each of us might wish to be remembered? And how we might want Grace Church remembered long after we're gone? Would it be something of earth-shaking importance? Maybe not. Perhaps it would be more like our friend's plaque over there on the wall. In the words from Mark's Gospel, she has done what she could. Amen.